Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. On behalf of the Alexandria Association, it is my pleasure to welcome you today for today's meeting. My name is Matthew, and I have a pleasure of welcoming you to this gathering. I will be guiding our conversation together with my co-host, Adam Ostrowski, a doctoral student from IFISPAN. Adam and I are delighted to lead today's dialogue. Uh, we would like to welcome our guest this evening, Professor Richard Kearney. Many of you will know him, his work, especially The Gods Who May Be and Anatheism, which has recently been translated into Polish and has already sparked a lively discussion here. Kearney thought moves between hermeneutics and phenomenology, ethics and philosophy of religion, always returning to the question of how we encounter the divine, the stranger, and the other in the post-secular age. Before we begin this conversation, let me briefly outline the plan of today's event. We will start with the short introduction by Professor Kearney. After that, Adam and I will lead a structured dialogue with him, moving through several themes in his works. And finally, we will open the floor for questions from the audience so that this can become a shared rather than a one-way conversation. Professor Kearney, thank you very much for being with us today, and we are truly honored to have you here.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm very happy to begin with a few introductory words and definitions of anatheism for whatever 10, 15 minutes before passing on to you for the conversation and dialogue. So the first thing I would say about anatheism is to do with the prefix ana, which is not theism and it's not atheism, it's anatheism. Meaning at one level, theism again, theism after atheism, or before the alternative, theism, atheism. And we can come back to that. Ana, as a definition in the English Oxford Dictionary, means, I quote, up, back, before, after, in time and space. So in a way, anatheism is what comes before and after God. And some would say in the European context, after the death of God. Paul Ricoeur, my mentor in Paris for my PhD, used to write about faith as a movement from a first naivete, where one believes in everything, the naivety, the naive belief, let's say, of a child or a childish mind, to critique or disbelief or doubt, which is very often where philosophy comes in, and then a possibility of a return to what he calls a second naivete, a second innocence, a second affirmation after the negation of atheism, which can be a very salutary and necessary thing in philosophy. Ricoeur names what he calls the three masters of suspicion: Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. Today, we could add many more masters of suspicion to that. The Frankfurt School, critique of ideology, feminism, and environmental criticism, so many other philosophies which put into question our received beliefs and dogmatisms and doctrines. The second thing I would say is, after the definition of anatheism, ana, also a word in Greek, which you find in anagogy, anaphora, anamnesis. Plato talks about anamnesis as this remembrance of the past, which then enables us to go forward. But leaving the definition aside for now, we can come back if you wish in discussion. I would also say that anatheism is conceived by me as a noun more than a verb. So I could talk, or we could talk about anatheologizing or anaphilosophizing. It's a process, it's a movement, it's a dialectic. It's not something given. It's not kind of a belief or a religion that you discover and then fixate on as the last word. And a phrase I often use to describe anatheism in sort of colloquial terms is the term adieu. And adieu, as Emmanuel Levinas, another of my mentors in France, mentioned or pointed out in colloquial French, and to some extent in English too, adieu can mean goodbye, but it can also mean hello, like salut, which is salvation, as a phrase of greeting or as a phrase of departure. And I see anatheism as governed by this address of welcoming and also departing, and then welcoming again, so to speak. Let me give maybe two examples, one from literature and one from religion. From literature, in the book Anatheism, I take the definition of Keats, John Keats, the famous English romantic, who talks about the poetic attitude as negative capability. And what he means by that is, I quote, the ability to be in mystery, uncertainty, and doubt without the least hankering after fact and reason. So it's to be in that sort of state of bewilderment, searching, wondering, questioning, that then can lead as a negative capability, sort of an apophatic movement, to a new cataphatic movement or position, which comes after negative capability and is a positive capability. As Ricoeur says, you go from a primary affirmation through a negation to a secondary affirmation. So that's really what I'm trying to get at. The poets have no difficulty. You know, as the Buddha said, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. And that was picked up by the poet singer Donovan in his famous song in the 60s. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. And you can say that about anything. As Paul Ricoeur says, the shortest route from self to self is through the other, through the stranger, through that which is in a way unknowable and unfathomable. By traversing that dark night of unknowing, that docta ignorantia, as Kuzana said, you can return to a new faith, a new affirmation. But it's never a final affirmation. Once you reach that position, a bit like Kierkegaard's leap of faith, after the aesthetic and the ethical, you come to the religious leap of faith. That doesn't end the story. After the leap of faith, the religious night can become ethical and aesthetic again. And it's an ongoing series of what I call anatheist wagers. So the second example I'd like to take from literature is that of the Catholic Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who talked about moving from his initial faith as a novice, you know, a religious Ignatian Jesuit novice, to a dark night of the soul, a big depression, a big disillusionment. And then after that, a return to what he called aftering, a poetic aftering, that after the dark night of the soul came this extraordinary appreciation and celebration of all that is. And this is conveyed in poems like Pied Beauty, where he celebrates everything that is counter-original, spare, and strange. Everything in the world suddenly becomes an epiphany. And there's a beautiful poem called The Kingfisher, which ends as follows, which is kind of a celebration of Christ in everything, including kingfishers and stones and trees and people and animals. And it's a pied beauty because it's speckled, pied as in the Pied Piper, as in the pied coloring and patterning on the back of a cow. It's a multiple beauty. It's a scattered beauty. It's a beauty that's everywhere and in all things. And he ends the poem by saying, Christ plays in 10,000 faces, lovely in limbs, lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. In other words, Christ is in every face. Moving on from that poetic religious position to other examples of religion, very, very briefly, I don't want to go over 10 or 15 minutes here. This is something I don't actually mention in the book Anatheism, but it's come back to me in various discussions when people have asked me for a definition, a Christian definition of how does it apply to Christianity. And the example I give is of that of Christ on the cross. There's the moment of Gethsemane in the garden where he asks God to deliver him. Let this chalice pass from me. In other words, don't let me die. Don't let me be crucified. And that's the moment of theism, but a kind of a naive theism, believing in a theodicy or an alpha God, an omni God who is capable of coming down and rescuing him or preventing the moment of cruelty and crucifixion. Then he finds himself, that is the first moment of theism, naive theism, a first naivete, a sort of a dogmatic theism in a tribal, all-powerful God who can rescue us from our suffering or from Auschwitz or from wherever, Gaza, wherever we find ourselves in the midst of suffering. That's kind of a naive, childish theism. And that God dies in the hangman's noose in Auschwitz, as Elie Wiesel said, who had been to Auschwitz himself and said afterwards, who can believe in God when we all prayed to God and we all died? 6 million of us died. He was talking about his own Jewish culture and people. And then back to Christ, he moves on to the cross, and not through his own doing or his own will. It happens, and on the cross he calls out to his Father and he says, why have you abandoned me? My God, why have you abandoned me? And that's the moment of atheism. That's when Christ is an atheist. He's been abandoned by the Father, the omni God, the alpha God, and he is helpless and hopeless and alone. And in that moment of radical atheism, he's lacking God. And then the moment of anatheism on the cross is where he, as it were, abandons himself to what is happening, to the event. And he says, unto thee I commend my spirit. And that's the moment of returning to a faith. But after the loss of faith, my God, why have you forsaken me, which itself is a loss of that naive faith that the Father will come and rescue us from all ills. There are many other instances, but I'll let them go for now. In the Gospels, where Christ encounters a stranger, the Syrophoenician woman, the Samaritan at the well, and is, as it were, instructed and apprenticed to his messianic condition, because they teach him things that he didn't know before. The Syrophoenician woman says, look, you won't let me come near you so that I can plead with you to cure my sick daughter, but you're surrounded by your male disciples. I know I'm a Gentile woman. I speak Greek. I don't speak Aramaic or Hebrew. I'm an outsider. I'm a stranger. I'm diseased. I carry disease and strangeness. But you're feeding your dogs with the crumbs that fall from the table. Why don't you treat me as a dog and give me some crumbs so that my daughter can be healed? And then Christ, in that moment, comes to an anatheist recognition, a new recognition of what his messianic divinity is all about, his messianic mission, which is to give to the stranger. And then that comes up in Matthew 25, isn't it? Where Christ, they ask, who were you? Did we ever meet you or see you? And he said, yes, every time somebody asked for water or food and you gave it to them. And he says the stranger, he uses the word hospes 4 times in that passage, Matthew 25. So Christ is the stranger. Christ learns to become the stranger by meeting other strangers, Samaritan women, Syrophoenician women, and so on. There are many strangers in the Gospels. So there is kind of a second belief after the death of God on the cross, of God, the Omni Father, the Alpha Father, the God of power and might. There's then the loss of that, the death of that God, and then the renewal, rebirth, resurrection, if you will, of a second God after God, a second naivety, a second faith. And a third and last example I'd give is that in the Old Testament of Abraham and the strangers, when they appear out of the desert in Genesis, and Abraham and Sarah are under the Mamre tree, the tree at Mamre, and the strangers arrive. And the first reaction, of course, is one of fear and of defensiveness. These are three strangers. We don't know who they are. They don't speak our language. They don't have the same colors of skin as us. So the natural thing to do is to kill them, is to say, no, you're not welcome here. You're a threat. But instead of that, initial tribal reaction, you're not part of our religion. You don't know our God. You are strangers. They open their arms to these strangers. They give them food. And in the giving of food, the three strangers become one God. And God is revealed through the act of hospitality of Abraham and Sarah to the stranger. And then you move, having left your old God go, your first naive, dogmatic God, your tribal God, having abandoned that, adieu, said goodbye to that, in the act of hospitality, the divine becomes revealed through the epiphany of strangers sharing food. And then the final moment where that anatheism is expressed is when the impossible becomes possible, when Sarah and Abraham say they can't have a child. The strangers say, you will conceive a child, and they say it's impossible. Sarah's barren. Abraham is past his age for fathering, and they say, we will return in 9 months and you will be with child, who is Isaac. And Isaac, of course, in Hebrew means laughter. And what is the reaction of Sarah when she hears that the impossible might be made possible? The adunaton could be dunaton, made possible. She laughs and gives the name of laughter to her child, because laughter is second faith. It's believing in the impossible becoming possible. And I'll just end with this. These very words from Genesis are used by Luke in the Gospel of Luke when the stranger enters the house of Mary in Nazareth and declares that she will have a child. And she ponders and is puzzled. There the phrase is used in the passage in Luke, and then eventually says amen. And that's the anatheist moment. But the words used are, she says it's impossible. I'm a virgin. I can't have a child. And they say, but what is impossible to you and to humans, finite humans, is possible to God. And that's a moment also of moving from theism to atheism to anatheism, where the amen of Mary echoes the laughter of Sarah. And the same phrases are used. The adunatan in the Greek translation, in the Septuagint, the impossible is suddenly possible, dunatan. And dunatan also, as possibility, comes from dunamis, which is the Greek word for something dynamic, something possible, that's a potency, that's a power, but it's an anatheist power of the powerless. It's the power of the least of these. It's the power of the weak God over the strong God. But there is nothing more powerful than the powerless. That's one of the lessons of anatheism. One obviously embodied by Christ on the cross, by Martin Luther King, and by Mandela, who came across his great insights in a prison, deprived of everything, by Gandhi, by all those who were considered the weakest of all, who actually became the ones who changed and transformed society and humanity for the better. So I'll end with that. I went a little over time, I think, a few minutes, but very glad to engage in conversation now. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for this short introduction. And I want to start with some general questions. So firstly, do you think that the emergence of anatheism is something historically necessary? a kind of inevitable response to the crisis of modernity? So, in other words, a modern episode? Or do you see anatheism as having elements and was always there inside the religion? Or maybe both of these positions at the same time?
Yeah, I would say both. It's a both and. It's always been there. I mean, I just gave you some examples from, Abraham and Jesus. So that's just in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the Buddhist tradition has it too. First there was no mountain, then there is a mountain. Sorry, first there was a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. So you can find it in any wisdom tradition if you look hard enough. In anatheism, I confess very clearly from the beginning, I'm speaking from the Abrahamic tradition, and mainly Christian because that's my narrative, that's my destiny by birth, but which I can renew by choice. But it's that tradition, and I do mention the Judaic and the Islamic also in anatheism. I don't go into the Eastern religions of Hinduism and Buddhism and indigenous religions, for example, Taoism and then Native American or Aboriginal religions. But my wager is it's there too. It's there in all the wisdom traditions from the beginning. But it's there as a possibility that can be renewed at different times. And to come to the second option, or the first option that you propose, it's particularly important today, after the death of God, which is a moment and a necessary moment of modernity. And then after what you might call the flight of the gods or of the divine through the horrors of the 20th century, through Hiroshima, through the gulags, through Auschwitz, and the mass destruction and carnage of those totalitarian regimes that killed so many people. And today, we talk about the current war in Iran and in Gaza, in Ukraine. There is horror, and in those moments of horror where there can't be a God present, given that so many, suffering believers call out to God, their God, whether it's Allah or Abba or whatever, Elohim, and God doesn't answer. The Alpha God doesn't answer. There is then this moment of radical disillusionment. Ditto for the climate, the fact that what seemed like an incredibly optimistic culture, technologically, politically, post-Enlightenment, we're all progressing towards, the perfect society. And that was the faith of modernity. We've lost that faith after Auschwitz and the gulags and Hiroshima and current wars and totalitarianism today. So there's a particular need, I would say now, for anatheism, but it's not a necessity. It doesn't have to happen. Just as the resistance to the climate disaster doesn't have to be doesn't have to work. It may be that the planet disappears, right? But anatheism would be the constant, repetitive return of a belief and a faith that if enough of us gather together in small communities, and that becomes a movement and a process. And anatheism, as I say, is a verb, not a noun. It's not a necessity. It's always a possibility, and that's why we can wager in it that we believe that the impossible, i.e., the salvation of the planet, the saving of the planet from climate disaster, and the end of wars, which it seems impossible, can be possible once again. The adunaton can be dunaton once again. And dunamis is a word used in St. Paul and many of the gospel writings and post-gospel writings in the theologians and the patristic fathers and so on, but particularly St. Paul. The word for the Spirit, that is the promise of the kingdom, the promise of the Messiah coming back again, is called dunamis, potency, possibility.
All right. I think you covered quite a lot of points in that response to the question. I would like to build on that towards a more ethical or social perspective here. Would you say that there exists some limit or a boundary to the openness, the fluidity, and the, let's say, Derridianesque erring which is inherent to the anatheist approach, other than hostility as a possible response to hospitality that you mention in your book? Is there an end to this desire towards the other and the stranger, which could stop the dialogue that you hope for
Mm.
as a possible perspective?
Yeah, I would say there is no end to the possibility um, of reconciliation and peace and justice. There is no end to the desire for it, to the hoping for it, to the praying for it, to the searching for it, to the struggle towards it. There's no end to that. But so it's up to us. It's up to us. In a way, if you want to talk anatheologically, one could say that the divine is a constant call to make the impossible possible. So the divine is the possible. The divine is dunamis, which is St. Paul's word for the spirit that comes after the death of Christ. And then when Christ disappears, he said, I must go so that the spirit can come. And that's possibility. So possibility never disappears. But I would not consider anatheism a Derridian position. In fact, I've had several published dialogues with Derrida, including one month after 9/11 when we met in New York and we had a discussion about possibility. And he said, there's the thinnest of differences between our positions, between your hermeneutic position, anatheism, the God who may be, which he was reading at the time, and my position, because my position, which he called Cora, is that of an openness that is unconditional to whatever happens and whoever comes. And I said, well, is there any limit to that, as you just asked? And he said, there is no limit. When the stranger knocks at the door, the hospitality must be absolute, unconditional, if it is to be pure. And I said, well, does that mean anybody can enter the door? And he said, yes. And I said, so we can make no distinction when somebody knocks at the door, it's an old Kantian model, of course, between the Nazi who is entering to slaughter the Jewish children that you are harboring and defending, and a child who is being persecuted by the Nazis and seeks shelter and a sanctuary. Are you telling me, Jacques Derrida, that there's no limit to who we let in? And he said, no, we must be prepared to just let everybody in. That's pure hospitality. Now, there's conditional hospitality where you make discernments, hermeneutic discernments, as to who should be let in and who shouldn't. And that's more Ricoeur's position than my position. And who do I let in? I let those in who are on the side of love and justice. And I leave those out who are on the side of hatred, cruelty, and torture and violation. And that distinction has to be made. That's what I call the wager and hermeneutic discernment. And what is discernment? It's actually translated from the Hebrew in one of the Psalms. The discerning heart is the attentive heart, the heart that is attentive to differences. And there is a difference between a Nazi who slaughters innocent children and an innocent child who calls out to be welcomed and saved from such violence. So for me, there is a limit to that. And there are decisions to be made. I just end with a quote from Dorothy Day, who I think is about to be sainted, but she was the leader of the workers' movement. You may know her in America in the sort of 50s and 60s, and she had hospitality houses. And she said one of the most difficult moments for her as the host of a hospitality house where poor people came, people who had no shelter, no food and so on, was when somebody knocked at the door to know whether that person who wants to enter is going to bring a gun or a knife with him and murder his wife, who he's been battering and abusing, and who has sought shelter in the hospitality house. And Dorothy Day has given her shelter. She's let that stranger in, who is seeking love and peace and justice. But she doesn't let in the murderer with the knife and the gun with a heart full of hatred. And that's a difficult decision to make sometimes, because you don't know. So you don't know absolutely whether the man at the door is a homicidal murderer or is actually Jean Valjean, the prisoner, the ex-prisoner that nobody will let in, looking for some kind of salvation or some kind of rescue. And it's a very hard decision, but decisions have to be made. So for me, and I wrote a book on this, on hospitality, hospitality in action. Hospitality is hovering between the unconditional, everybody's welcome, and the conditional. You're let in, but on certain conditions, that you're on the side of love and justice, and you're not on the side of hatred and violence. So that's what I would say about that. There is a limit, but it's a limit that we should try and constantly worry about and enlarge. We should keep the door as open as possible, but we can't keep it totally open.
We have already mentioned Derrida, so perhaps we can now widen the frame and ask about how your works converses with other postmodern and post-secular attempts to rethink the divine. I'm mostly interested with Jean-Luc Marion, who has a different notion or different approach than you, which is concentrated on, based upon the saturated phenomenon. Looking back on this long conversation with Marion, which you have across many of your books, how does Anatheism relate to or depart from his phenomenology of givenness?
Yeah. Well, Derrida called himself an atheist anatheist, because, as he's always insisted, he rightly passes for an atheist. But he is an atheist who seeks God, like the madman in Nietzsche's passage in the Gay Science, who declares the death of God. He arrives by saying, I seek God, I seek God. And I think in that respect, Derrida is an atheist who seeks God. He actually says at one point in his little book on Sauf le nom, he says, let me get this right now, atheism is the desire for God in the desert. Right? So you're alone. It's a barren, empty world. It's Korah, which is no power at all, he says. Whereas I'm talking about possibility as a power of the powerless. But Derrida responds in our dialogue by saying Korah has no power at all. Korah doesn't care. Korah doesn't love. Korah doesn't save. Korah is a neutral, impassive space that precedes the difference between theism and atheism. But coming out of that, Derrida chooses atheism, Marion chooses theism, I choose anatheism. And I've made my differences clear, I think, with Derrida, who has an unconditional approach to the other, whereas I have a conditional approach, or a hermeneutic one of wagering. I don't know who the other is, and I'm prepared to be as open as possible, but not to the point of surrendering to evil. Let's put it like that. Whereas for Derrida, tout autre est tout autre. Every other is every other, and is radically other, and we cannot tell the difference. And in that he shares the position of Levinas, who said we must treat the torturer, the persecutor, even in Auschwitz, as a stranger with a face. And I sort of draw the limit there for political, ethical reasons, not because I don't believe that Nazi couldn't change his heart or her heart at some point, but that in the immediate moment, I have to make a wager whether I'm going to be on the side of that Nazi murderer or on the side of the child being murdered. So that's where we differ. For Derrida, there's no difference between a monster and a messiah when somebody knocks on the door. For me, there is, and we are responsible for making decisions about whether the stranger is messianic in that moment or is monstrous. Regarding Marion, I'll be brief here. My main difference with Marion, again, we've had several published dialogues in this regard, is that for me, saturation and God as the ultimate experience of saturation takes away human agency. There's no room for, in a way, humanism or existentialism for Marion, because saturation, to the extent that you open yourself to it and receive it, means that you're a total recipient without agency, choice, or responsibility. So if Sartre is one extreme, Marion is the other. It's pure passivity. It's pure lack of agency, because saturation is actually what leaves the subject. The phrase that Marion uses is interloqué, which could be translated into English, I don't know about Polish, as interlocuted. And to be interlocuted, interloqué is to be, je suis interloqué. I can't say anything. I can't do anything. I'm completely stupefied in a way. I'm dumbfounded, to use English word. I'm rendered dumb and stupid and radically passive. And there I disagree with, fundamentally with Marion. There's something of an existentialist still in Anatheism for me. Not the atheistic existentialism of Sartre, Beauvoir, and even up to a point Merleau-Ponty, but an existentialism of agency. We're still responsible. We're still free. And I see agency, responsibility, and freedom being removed from the ultimate and absolute act of saturation in Marion.
I will continue, since my friend is missing in action at the moment. I would like to broaden the frame towards feminist thought and a kind of apathetic approach that you seem to be a fan of. I was looking through your conversation with Julia Kristeva today from a few years back. And she, among others, argued that the symbolic order of God language is deeply gendered, often excluding or marginalizing the feminine.
Yeah.
Would you see anatheism as capable of transforming this symbolic order, or does it still operate within inherited linguistic and imaginative frameworks? And the risk of casting the divine as either maternal or paternal are reflected in psychoanalysis throughout the years. So the question that moves from feminist thought towards the negative apophatic theology is whether anatheism is also trying to free God from this kind of gendered images, which might appear as idols in the end.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm very, very close to Kristeva in this regard, although she also, like Derrida, says she rightly passes for an atheist, but she's an atheist who is fascinated by religion and by, again, the human search and desire for God, which she sees as absolutely fundamental to the human psyche. So anatheism is on the side of the apophatic. That's the first A of ana, adieu, goodbye. And that means goodbye to gendered language in the sense of naive, the first naivete of a gendered language. So a matriarchal religion or a patriarchal religion. In the West, we're more, as it were, contaminated historically by the patriarchal. We are, as Derrida would say, phallogocentric. So that God of might and power, the Alpha God, as I call it, the Omni God, is one that needs to be deconstructed or negated apophatically. And that's the moment of, actually in Anatheism, that's the moment of atheism. Goodbye to the God who will be, omniscient and omnipotent and save us all by fiat, regardless of what we do or how we behave. So it's apophatic in that regard. And that would include the symbolic in Christeva, which contains the patriarchal and the gendering. But I wouldn't just leave it there, that the divine is genderless, because the divine, as Hopkins says, plays in 10,000 faces. Lovely in eyes, lovely in limbs, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. But he should have said men's faces and women's faces, but he meant men's as in man, humanity. But he didn't say that, he said men's faces. And Anatheism would add men's and women's faces, but not in a sense of opposition, that it's either matriarchal or a patriarchal, but that you can return after you have, as it were, negated apophatically and critiqued hermeneutically and deconstructed mystically. Once you have done that negative apophatic work of negative theology, there is another second positive or affirmative theology where the divine as man or woman can return. But I would actually say as men or women or whatever, transgender or both. I mean, I have no problem with genders and of whatever kind, or however multiple, because Christ plays in 10,000 faces. And those faces, after the death of patriarchy and matriarchy, can be men's and women's faces, but in a new sense. And that's the Anatheist retrieval of men and women as strangers who have not been known in a fully liberated sense, in terms of class, in terms of creed, and in terms of gender, that there's new possibilities of relationship between men and women. And Christeva was very keen on that and argued accordingly for a return from a pure obsession with the symbolic, right, where we're into images and symbols and idols, your word, of God as this kind of God or that kind of God, including feminine and masculine. And there she shares with me and with Marion a critique of what Marion called conceptual idolatry. We can have a concept of God which fixes it and fixates it and limits it and fetishizes it and reifies it. And a lot of what Marion would call metaphysics, what Heidegger would have called ontotheology, does just that, conceptual idolatry. But Christeva's right, through her psychoanalytic linguistic method, to say that that's also symbolic idolatry. We can have symbolic idolatry. But symbols can be deconstructed and reconstructed by embracing what she calls the semiotic, that is prior to the symbolic, that is pre-verbal, and that she links with the relationship actually of mother and child. Even in the womb, it's a relationship of touch and trust, and reliance is a word. Reliance, a kind of a connecting, reconnecting of one person with another, which begins at the semiotic level of the tactile, the olfactory, all of the senses in a way. It's visual as well, but it is pre-verbal, it's pre-linguistic, it's pre-symbolic. And she's not saying let's get rid of the symbolic and stop speaking and stop making images and symbols and even concepts. She's saying, of course we must keep that. That's philosophy, that's theology, that's politics, that's society, that's speech, that's communication. But we should not lose sight of the fact that beneath and beyond the symbolic, which is absolutely necessary and indispensable, there is also the semiotic, which is another mode of connection and interconnection. almost like the mycorrhizal connections of these rhizomes that connect everything under trees and connect trees to each other. That's kind of the semiotic. It works like that between people. And I wrote a little book on touch where I say the tactile is the primary sense, because it's not just you touching somebody. When you touch somebody, you're also touched. It's the old phenomenological example of Husserl and then Merleau-Ponty. When a hand touches a hand, you are touched and you're touching at the same time. And that's the semiotic. You're constantly tactile and tangible, and therefore vulnerable and open and exposed to the other, and vice versa. Whereas the symbolic is much more, you're in control of your words, you're in control of your meanings, and you mean what you say and you say what you mean. The semiotic is closer to a more unconscious, preconscious, tactile interconnectivity between beings.
I got disconnected for a while, which I apologize for, but I think we are starting to get into the very important topic for my own philosophical development, which is that of the embodiment. So I want to ask you about what dimensions, other than tactile, but like general embodiment, play in the whole anatheistic framework. For example, you have this fivefold movement, and I'm wondering, for example, the epiphany is always embodied, and our connection to sacred in sacraments, it's also embodied. So I'm wondering, what are the dimensions of the body that plays in your system?
Yeah, well, they're huge. I have a recent book called Anacarnation. So anatheism is anacarnation. And it's open to all wisdom traditions, it's open to all spiritualities, and it's open to all human beings. It's open to all human and non-human beings. It's open to anyone or anything that embodies the word. It's word made flesh. And again, I come back to Hopkins, Christ plays in 10,000 faces. Anacarnation, which is the transformation of word into flesh, and the reconnecting, the continuous reconnecting of flesh with word. We're kind of back to the relation with the symbolic and the semiotic again, Chris Davis terms. And flesh and word, of course, are straight out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But it's said that Levinas says God created man in order to have somebody to talk to, because it was lonely being a disembodied, disincarnate God. So the person that God creates, according to Genesis, is the human, Adameth, the first human being, and Eve, of course. And Adameth, translated to the new translation into French, is called the muddy one, le début. And I really like that, because we are muddy ones. The human is humus, it's earth. We are earth. And it's only when we recognize that we are earth and flesh, and therefore vulnerable and tactile and tangible, because it's through touch, being touched and touching in this mutual reciprocal way, that we realize with a new humility, again from humus, that we're earthy beings, and our humanity comes from that. And it's only when we realize that we are humus, human, humble, that we can also have humor, which is laughter. And laughter is the ultimate word made flesh of anatheism. There's a wonderful phrase saying by Meister Eckhart, the mystic, who says of the Trinity of creation, the perichoresis, the three persons that are circling around what? A bowl of food, a Eucharistic sacramental bowl of food and wine. So the three persons circling and dancing in the perichoresis, which you see in the Andrei Rublev famous icon, are circling food, earth, nourishment, Eucharist, if you will. And Andrei Rublev, who's trying to portray the three persons of the Trinity, portrays them as three strangers under the mamre tree. who are eating the food and tasting the food and touching the food that Abraham and Sarah have given them. So the Trinity is actually called in Andrei Rublev's icon of the three persons moving around the bowl of food. It's called the hospitality of Abraham, right? So in order to portray what the Trinity means for Christianity, Eckhart, who is a Christian mystic, takes an embodied scene of Abraham feeding three strangers, right? So that's why Christ is bread and wine. That's the earth. That's the word made flesh. That's absolutely important. And when Christ comes back from the dead, so as a God after God, what does he do? He feeds people. He's standing at the side of the shore, and the disciples come back from their fishing, and he's cooking fish for them. They don't recognize him until he gives them fish. And then they realize that in the giving and receiving of fish, of food, of flesh, if you will, the flesh of the fish, the animal in the sea, they recognize Christ. Just as Thomas does by touching his body, touching the wound, the suffering Christ. Just as the disciples in Emmaus only recognize Christ as Christ, anatheistically, after the death of God, they recognize the returned God, if you will, God-man, Word made flesh. When they go into the inn, when they're talking and looking at each other, they don't recognize Jesus as Christ. But they do recognize Christ as the one who returns, as the one who gives fish, or in that instance, the one who invites them into the inn of Emmaus and breaks bread. So Christ comes back, not as Jesus. Jesus is dead. Christ is not the proper name, the surname of Jesus as first name. Jesus was Word made flesh, Christ in one instance, but is resurrected and rebirthed anacarnationally and anatheistically every time somebody gives food and water to a stranger or receives it from a stranger. So it's the host and the stranger being hosted. And that happens all the time. That's why Christ plays in 10,000 faces. Every moment there are Christian incarnations, words made flesh. And I'll just end with the quote from Meister Eckhart that I promised to cite and then went into a parenthesis. He defines the Trinity as such: the Father laughed and gave birth to the Son. The Son laughed and gave birth to the Spirit. The Spirit laughed and gave birth to the Father. And it goes on in this endless hermeneutic, anatheist, anacarnational circle of laughter. Because laughter is a response to the impossibility of the possible, and yet, in spite of the impossible, believing that there is still a possible, another possible beyond the impossible.
Before we pass the floor to, or give the floor to the audience and their questions, I have another probably final one, which echoes the theologies of the death of God that you make references to. If anatheism is an affirmation of restlessness, which should never stop at fixed images of the divine, always risking a kind of religious homelessness, then this distraction of idols begins with the death of the omni-god for the sake of an emerging God of life, event, and authentic mystery. Would you say that there exists a possibility that this fragile, authentic God of openness could itself become another idol which will need to be transgressed as well? Would it be part of the anatheist logic, or is it a contradiction?
I would say it's neither. Anatheism is not indiscriminate, unconditional openness to whatever happens. That's deconstruction. That's Derrida. It's a wagering in love and justice. And at one point in the Garden maybe I'd say I'm a Christian until and unless it offends love and justice, in which case I'm a seeker of God. But to the extent that that search offends love and justice, I am simply a seeker of love and justice. So love and justice, for me, are the divine. And that's not an endless openness, because an endless openness is an openness to anything. And that's my problem with Derridian deconstruction. But back to your question of idols, Anatheism would become an idol if it became a religion and ceased to be a faith. And there I'm using Ricoeur's terms. Because religion can be fixed and fixated and stratified and structured in such a way that there's them and there's us. You're not going to be saved unless you're baptized in our faith, for example. Whereas I like Origen, who believed in universal baptism. As soon as you're born, you're baptized. You know, you're good. The original innocence of creation, when God in the Abrahamic tradition in Genesis creates the world, he says it is good. So Anatheism is the belief in the primacy of the good, but the recognition that there is evil everywhere. It's a belief in peace and justice and love, but it's a recognition that those symbols, those actions are egregiously lacking everywhere we look. But there are still instances where Christ plays in 10,000 faces and where people do give bread to each other and receive bread. And that's what we've got to wager on and commit ourselves to. So it's not an endless welcoming of everything. It's an adieu in terms of welcome, but it's also an adieu in terms of goodbye to that which offends against love and justice and destroys love and justice. And Ricoeur again has a nice phrase where he says, we must smash the idols so that the symbols can speak, the symbols of the sacred. And that's symbols in a positive sense. And I think that's very true, that Anatheism is a constant smashing of the idols, and including Anatheism, if it becomes a new religion, and we're all going to be Anatheists, and these are the rules, and anybody who's not an Anatheist is wrong, right? And will be damned, and only Anatheists, are on the side of the good. That could become an idol and a form of idolatry if it was codified and in an exclusive, dogmatic way. So we must be constantly open to the idol being smashed, deconstructed, whatever, demystified, so that the symbol of Anatheist as anatheologizing, anaphilosophizing, anacarnating can continue. And I just want to return for one moment to the question of, indefinite and indiscriminate openness. I'm not saying all the traditions of the past are dead and gone and we should invent a new religion and call it Anatheism. I'm actually saying that every tradition, every religious tradition, every wisdom tradition can pass through a moment of apophatic doubt, negation, critique, in order to embrace the possibility of a return to what is best in those traditions. And for me, in the God Who May Be and in Anatheism, the tradition I choose, because it's the one I know, to analyze and discuss and engage with is the Judeo-Christian. And I do believe that, and I've given examples, that Christ, even though in hic signo, under the sign of Christ, the Crusades went forth and slaughtered the Muslims and non-Christians. And every religion has done that, including the Buddhists. And that's where any religion needs to be demystified and deconstructed in order that faith can return. And all religious wisdom traditions were once faith that then were covered over, and a sclerosis and a fetishism sort of congealed them into a position which prevented the anatheist disposition of welcoming in the sense of adieu, welcoming the God in the stranger. And there was one final thing I just wanted to say very briefly. Yeah, and it comes back to actually your colleague's former question. I have a fellow from a Greek Orthodox philosopher who said Christ came to do two things, to touch and to eat. And I thought that was pretty good, because if you look at Christ's healings, 90% of them mentioned in the gospel involve touch. Christ touches. I won't go through all the examples, but the leper, he puts the leper, he touches. The blind man, he makes mud, goes back to the muddy one. The earthy one, he takes earth and mixes it with spittle or with water and touches the blind man's eyes, and so on. So it's touching or it's eating. From Cana, the first miracle, to the Last Supper, the last miracle, the last Epiphany, the last sacrament, he's feeding people, loaves and fishes, and even after he rises as a stranger Christ, because nobody recognizes him when he rises. Thomas doesn't believe in him. The disciples coming back in their fishing boat don't believe him as he cooks fish for them. The disciples on the way to Emmaus don't believe in him. Even Mary Magdalene, doesn't recognize him until he touches them or feeds them, or speaks in a certain way to them that touches their heart. And so that's very important for me in terms of atheism being an anacarnation, that the word of God, which can be multiple in different wisdom traditions, always comes as flesh, as embodied, as food. In fact, the first word for God in Hinduism is Anna, A-N-N-A, which means food. And food belongs to the flesh, and it's the word of the flesh. So it's a relationship that must be kept open. The word keeps everything open, and flesh incarnates it and embodies it in a particular singular face, hands, feet, the particular imprint, fingerprint of each person. What Scotus called their thisness or thatness, their heitas. That's how God is revealed, in that singularity of each face, each limb, each eye, each hand.
Thank you very much. At this point, we would like to open the floor to the questions from the audience. So please feel free to share your thoughts and ask anything that came up during the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe I start. I have one question, maybe more practical question about your concept. I have a question regarding the fivefold movement of Anatheism. You describe it in terms of imagination, humor, commitment, discernment, and hospitality.
Discernment.
Discernment, yes.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask two things. First, how can this be applied in our everyday lives? How to Anatheism can apply it in our life, our everyday life? Is it possible or not? Or it is only for a more advanced philosophical concept?
Yeah, good question. I believe anatheism is for everybody. And if I wrote about anatheism, it is because, and only because, I have witnessed it under those five elements in people that I have known and that I have appreciated. So that's why I give so many examples. When I talk about hospitality, I give examples of hospitality, whether it's Dorothy Day or Gandhi or whatever. And I give examples of discernment. Abraham discerning between the strangers, Mary as Nazareth discerning between this man who walks in the door and says he's a messenger of God and that she will have a child. That's a discernment. It's not, okay, so I'm taking those examples from sacred literature. I also use secular literature for many of my examples, sort of Babette's Feast, where Babette gives to all the disillusioned, alienated, suffering, scarred citizens of the village, and in giving them food, they're cured. I mean, that's another example. Again, it's a literary one, but there are food kitchens throughout Boston where people give up their time and energy and money to feed the poor. That's going on. That hospitality is going on every day. So all of those, and there were people laughing every day, right? Laughter is not something I'm making up as some kind of ideal, transcendental, utopian goal. People laugh all the time. And they laugh in a very human, humorous, accepting way. I run a thing called the Guest Book, and I bring young people together from different communities who have hated each other, who've never spoken to each other, who've killed each other, and their parents and grandparents also. I won't go through all the examples, but Northern Ireland, South Africa, the Mexican-American border, Croatia, Serbs, and so on. But in practically each case where I organized an encounter, which was then videotaped, and it's on the website, guestbookproject.org, the reconciliation comes through humor. They laugh together. And that's the moment where there is kind of the most profound. There's discernment, there's understanding, there's hospitality, they share food, but it's in the humor, ultimately, that the divine resides. So I would see it as something very practical and very practiced, not just something for philosophers or, the great writers, or indeed the scribes of the Bible and the saints and the angels and the messiahs and the Buddhas and whatnot. We're all Buddhas as bodhisattvas. We're all Christs as incarnations or anacarnations of the act of sharing food and of touching people so you heal them miraculously, or just by being there as they're dying, as they're sick, as they're suffering. Putting your hand on the hand of somebody suffering during COVID or on the deathbed, that is anatheism. And I'll just give one more example of the very common experience of anatheism that I think I cite in the book at the beginning. Nobody is excluded from anatheism. It's not some elite of the enlightened who will save the world. It's happening all the time. And I give the example of the question, is there anybody on this earth who has not been sure of something and then woken at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the night, and asked, who am I? Where am I? And in fear and trembling, sweating, suffering, being lost, right? Is there anybody who has not been suffered and had a sense of abandonment, of loss, of grief, which is equivalent to atheism, has felt that they've been abandoned by God and not come back again to life? Most 90% do. Some commit suicide and they just can't take it. But 99% of people come through that dark night of the soul, that moment of doubt and despair. And it can be anybody, not even just in war zones. It can be anybody who has apparently everything in the world. Like Kierkegaard said, I went to a party, I was the heart and soul of the party, I laughed, I ate, I joked, and I came back home and wanted to put a bullet through my head. It's that even those who seem to have everything ultimately encounter a moment of nothing. So you go from primary theism, I have everything, to basic atheism, I have nothing, to the possibility of returning to something again. It's like Abraham has Isaac, he gives up Isaac, adieu, and then receives Isaac back 100-fold. That's anatheism. But it can happen to anybody. It does happen to everybody at some point in their lives. So all I'm doing in anatheism is describing what's already there. In sacred literature, in secular literature, in art, and in everyday lives of anybody on this earth.
Thank you so much.
And the next question actually comes from Karol Grabias, who actually wrote it down in the message, so maybe he can ask the question now.
Okay, first I would like to start by saying it's a great pleasure to see that Anatheism is gaining recognition in Poland, Professor. I really hope that someday you will come to Poland and we will have the occasion to meet in person. I have a question that is rather long, but I would like to be precise, and this is the question that I was thinking about for a long time.
Yeah.
From a hermeneutical perspective, critics of religion have challenged the claim to validity, truth claim of religious language on multiple levels. Philosophers have understood it as a mythical narrative of humanity's childhood, speculative metaphysical discourse, heteronomous source of morality, or eschatological promise of the future. And let's just mention four of them. I wonder whether your vision of Anatheism allows different modalities of post-critical faith that reimagine all these functions of religious language, or whether it accepts that some ways of articulating faith are permanently lost in religion. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, because it seems to me that some roles of religious language in Anatheism, such as metaphysical speculation, are lost causes, and other, for example, eschatological or ethical, are more likely to be reimagined.
Are more likely to be re-emergent. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Reimagined, yes.
Okay. And you're saying that some elements of religion and traditional religions are lost. Is that right? And transcended?
Whether some functions of religious language, like to be a mythical narrative of...
Yeah. Okay. For me, all those modes that you described of the mythical, the mystical, and I think you also maybe said metaphysical, just to take those three M's, that would be critiqued by militant atheists, right? Dennett and, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of the other, Hitchens, and several others, who have been very vehement in talking about religion as a God delusion. It's purely illusory. I mean, Freud said the same thing. So did Marx. It's the opium of the people. Freud says it's the illusion of the childish imagination that needs consolation. And Nietzsche just says, it's a lie that we make up in order to give away our power as will to power, and we give it away to a nobody God. You know all those critiques. And they're all necessary, but not to end there. Like, atheism is not the last word. And so anatheism is a way of saying, yes, you're right to critique notions of God, which are ideological and idolatrous, what we would call idolatrous, and mistaken, and have caused endless suffering through centuries and millennia, the sacrifice of children, the burning of witches and so-called heretics in the squares and the prisons of the great capitals of the world, the massacres of the conquistadores and the Puritans who arrived in North America, etc. I mean, the worst crimes have been committed by the religious. There's a phrase in Catholicism, corruptio optimi est pessima, that the worst is the corruption of the good. And in a way, religion was meant to represent the highest good, the highest God, but the worst crimes were committed in its name. And we don't have to go into, Islamic fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism or fascist fundamentalism with their Aryan gods to find examples of that. So I would say, in short, all of these critiques are necessary, but they're not indispensable, but they're not the last word. And that's where I disagree with militant atheism. It's a phase, it's a stage, a necessary one, but it's not the final one. So I would say, yes, there should be a re-emergence of the mystical. All that is good in the mystical, not what is mystificatory, but all that is good in Teresa of Avila, in Meister Eckhart, and there's a bit of a mystic in everybody, I would say. And I would say that of the mythic. We must, like Ricard does in Time and Narrative, revive and retrieve all that is good in mythic narrative. In fact, the word for story or narrative in Greek is mythos, right? So we should remember and retrieve our mythologies and the work of narrative, which is fundamental to religion, and extract from it the valid, legitimate, and continuing moments of faith, right? And I would say the same thing about the mythical, the mystical, or the metaphysical. You know, there's kind of a common practice, and I was subject to it myself for a while, coming from Heidegger right down to Marion, through Derrida, to that, you know, the history of philosophy is logocentric, is phallogocentric, is phonocentric, and therefore has occluded and covered up the truth of being. And so we must realize that we've forgotten being and we've replaced it with logocentrism. But the loss and forgetfulness of being was called metaphysics or ontotheology from this generation, running from Heidegger down to Marion, who still talks about the metaphysical as the untrue, the false, and saturation breaks through that. But I would say in each of the metaphysical thinkers, every single one of them, there is the possibility, in spite of the dogmatism where Aquinas becomes Thomism and scholasticism, Marx becomes Marxism, Aristotle becomes Aristotelianism, Plato becomes Platonism. In each of those cases, we've lost the faith and we've made a religion of those philosophers. So religion must be deconstructed, whether it's mystical, mythical, or metaphysical, so that what is good in religion can be retrieved as anatheistic faith.
Thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you. The next question will be from Antoni, who was the next in line.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask about two things. The first one is, do you see any possibility for the church on the grounds of anatheism? And when I mean church, I can imagine that you could argue for some kind of invisible church of people, of hospitable people laughing each other and so on. But do you see any possibility to returning to the church or to the institutionalized religion in any way? And that's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to ask, because I'm very curious about it, how would you compare anatheism with the weak religion of Gianni Vattimo, for example? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let me take the last question first. I have a lot of time for the weak religion, the weak theology, the weak God of Caputo and of Vattimo. But I think it's too weak. In other words, it takes the genuine power as dunamis out of the divine. And it makes the divine too passive, too minuscule. And even though God works through little things, he does so in a big way, you know. It's still the power of the powerless, and I don't think the divine should just be the powerless, the voiceless, the dispossessed. God is those too, but he's also, Gerard Manley Hopkins, celebrating the pied beauty of everything in the world. And you don't find that in Caputo. For example, I'm having a dialogue with Caputo next Monday on his new book, What to Believe. But for me, there's kind of a Nietzschean pessimism at the end of that, about kind of the destruction of the world. It's so, and yet there's a Druidian moment where we still say, yes, yes. But very often it's yes to the destruction of the planet. There's no commitment to an environmental struggle to save the planet and get together with people and act and protest, and even in small little groups, do something about it, march, plant trees, etc. I see none of that in Caputo or Vattimo. Their God, their religion is too weak in that sense. Although I'm totally for, Jesus's identification with the least of these, and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. But that doesn't have to mean a totally powerless God. It's the power of the powerless, but that power of the powerless is actually stronger than the power of the powerful. But it's still a power, and the word for power is dunamis. Hence, maybe, the God who maybe is the God of dunamis, the God of possibility beyond the impossible. Regarding the church, I would say any of the churches are not only capable, but I would say active in many regards in terms of anatheism. They may be institutionalized. They may have lots of doctrinal, dogmatic faults, where we're the saved and you're the damned. That obviously is a betrayal of, let's say, the Christianity of a true Christian church, just to stick with Christianity. But in the churches that I still encounter, they are now becoming more and more interreligious, interconfessional, in dialogue with others. The Vatican is even, promoting dialogues with non-Catholic and non-Christian religions. I see hospitality at work, people in food kitchens feeding the poor. I see struggles for love and justice, where the Christian churches march against, fundamental criminal behavior of capitalism, gross capitalism, or imperialism, or fascism, even here in America at the moment, but also in Russia and other dictatorships or potential dictatorships. I see in the churches a welcoming of immigrants. Very often immigrants, they give sanctuary to immigrants who otherwise would be imprisoned or sent packing or sent to prison. And I see a struggle for justice and fairness throughout the third world, the church in the third world, the theology of liberation that made an option for the poor at a certain point. And I don't think that has been completely betrayed. So I see a lot, anatheistically, I see a lot in the churches that is doing an extraordinary amount of good for love and justice. There's also a necessary critique, a self-critique in all of the churches to say, let's not become too dogmatic, too sure of ourselves, too certain of our, so-called truths and dogmas, such that we can't be open to genuine interreligious talk and conversation with those of other religions or of no religions. And it's interesting that Kristeva was chosen by, I'm not sure which pope, but was chosen as a representative in a big interconfessional meeting organized by the Vatican in Assisi, the birthplace of Francis of Assisi. And Kristeva was invited as the representative of atheism. And I thought that's a good one for the church. That's an anatheist gesture, because it acknowledges the importance of atheism within theism. It acknowledges the fact that they need each other as an anatheistic dialogue.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We have only 7 minutes left, so the last question would be the concluding question of today's meeting. So please, Paweł Rogala, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure listening to you. I've got one footnote and a question. Now, the footnote comes to my mind, or came to my mind rather, when you were talking about this child Nazi perpetrator image at the door.
Yeah.
And I've got a very bitter remark, and I came here for some consolation. So hopefully you shall help me with that. Our Polish Doris Day, I'm gonna make a long story short, has just issued an entry on Facebook writing, I've got in my hospitality houses in the center of Poland several Ukrainian disabled people. We've let them in because of the war, and the government has cut down on financial support for these families. In our government, we've got Christian Democrats, liberals, social democrats. So these people shouldn't have done that. And my bitter remark is that we should probably make this choice, whether we let a Nazi perpetrator in or a child, but then we should also think whether or not we are responsible enough to let people in, because there is probably not much that we can do about these people who have no means to survive. Probably they will survive somehow, but what a shame it is. And spontaneity sometimes it's quite good, but it's not enough. So there is this bitterness in me, and it's not against you, of course, but it's just, how many people in my country did not help, 3 years ago. So there is the third factor, I would say, and can you comment on that? Okay, about myself and standing at the door, and yeah, and then I know that it's quite late, but one of the best things about getting to know you as the public figure is finding out about a guest book project, which is quite a practical approach towards openness and hospitality. I would be very happy as a teacher. I teach at high school to listen to this just for 2 or 3 minutes, because this is a great idea. And the final, an easy question. Ariane Hirsi Ali, have you ever met her, and what do you think of her becoming Christian and this turning from militant atheism towards other positions? And that's it. Thank you very much for listening to you, and I'm very happy that this has happened.
Thank you for those great questions, and I'll try and be brief because I know our time is limited. Just beginning with the last question, I don't know of that person who underwent a conversion, Christian Ali. I've never heard of him or her.
She was an immigrant from Somalia. Then she moved from Holland to the United States. She's the wife of Niall Ferguson, I guess.
Oh yes, yeah, but I've heard of Niall Ferguson. But I have to say, I think I've heard rumors of Ali, but I don't know her enough or her story to comment. But I'll certainly look into it. It's very interesting. Regarding guest book, maybe I could give the link. It's all one word, guestbookproject.org, and I could share it with Casper or one of the organizers who could distribute it to you and others in this group, who could then look it up. And there's lots of examples of videos and so on, and I'd be happy to converse on email with you about which ones you might choose or for your students and so on. There's one set in Northern Ireland, there's one set in, as I said, Croatia, and one set in South Africa. So there's different examples.
So we can link. So we can use it. Okay.
Oh yeah, it's a website, and you can go on. It's on YouTube. You can download all the videos and their publications. They're mainly videos made by young people. That's what we ultimately. And some of them are story bites. They're about 2 or 3 minutes, and others are kind of short documentaries of maybe 5 to 10 minutes. But it's very pedagogical. It's actually been used in a lot of high schools throughout the world. So it would be wonderful if you did too. Then back to your first and kind of major question, standing at the door, and the fact that the Christian Democrats in your country, although they rule and govern, are, as I understood it, not feeding the hungry. But it seems to me that as such, they're not Christian Democrats. They're unchristian Democrats, because they're not following Christ, who says, feed the hungry, and who spent his life, as I said, healing and tasting and feeding and nourishing. So we need the miracle of the loaves and fishes everywhere, even where it seems impossible. And it does. I mean, we've got huge problems everywhere now. I have it in my native Ireland, where it seems we just can't take in any more immigrants. And yet that's an anatheistic wager, where we acknowledge that there are limits to housing, there's limits to available social services, health services, but we still keep having faith in the possibility of the impossible becoming a reality. We still keep having faith that something can change, that something can be reorganized such that we feed as many people as possible and give sanctuary to as many people as possible, even though we know there are limits to that. You know, Derrida has a famous line. I don't always agree with Derrida, and he says it, as you said, with bitterness. He says it with great deep regret and sorrow. He says, but it's a colloquial phrase, you can't feed every cat in the street, right? And you know, you feed your cat, and then maybe you feed the neighbor's cat, and then maybe you feed a stray cat, but you can't feed every cat in the street. And that's Derrida actually acknowledging certain limits. But where I'd agree with Derrida when he says it's impossible to feed every cat in the street, you must go beyond the impossible towards the dunamis of the impossible becoming possible in some way. We don't know at this stage, but we've got to imagine it. And that's why imagination is one of the phases, necessary phases of the anatheist wager. We must imagine possibilities of what now seems impossible. And that's where we must continue to have faith in the dunamis of the impossible becoming possible. And that, it seems to me, is the fundamental mythos, story, narrative of all wisdom traditions. It's making or trying to make the impossible possible. And I would end with, since I got a question on the earth earlier, I'm writing a book at the moment called Return to Earth, Back to Earth, towards an ecological hospitality. Because I think ecologically, we've got to have a new faith in the earth, in our planet, in all the elements in our planet. We've got to believe in the oceans. We've got to believe in the trees. We've got to believe in the animals. All the elements, all the species that are under threat. And our planet is under threat in a massive way. It's not a crisis, a climate crisis. It's a climate emergency. And there too, we've got to start imagining possibilities beyond the impossible, because it seems impossible as, you know, the temperature rises and there's more and more disasters, and people can just give up and say, well, I've got 20 years, I've got 50 years, I've got 100 years, and after that it's impossible. But we've got to continue to believe in humus, in the earth, and in humanity, and do so with humility, but also with the humor that says this is impossible, this is a contradiction, and yet the impossible can become possible. We believe in that and we seek that. And it's not easy. And we can't be naively utopian about it. We've got to be very practical. As we imagine, we've also got to act in a very practical, and I would say very local, concrete way at the beginning, in a schoolroom, right, with students. And I teach in classrooms too, you know, with a dozen or 24 students, talking to them, sharing stories with them of wisdom traditions, of great literary stories, you know, Jean Valjean receiving food, and the candlesticks from Monseigneur Muriel. You know, there's so many examples that we can teach, and then we can actually give bread and protest and so on, to give bread to those in need as much as we can. Can't give to everybody, can't feed every cat in the street, and protest against every injustice. And here in America at the moment, there are protests going on every week. A huge one next week here in Boston. And in Northern Ireland, where I grew up, and where there was gross injustice, that changed because of protests. You know, the civil rights movement was people, ordinary people of all ages, grandmothers, parents, friends, children, marching. And it changed. It changed a system of radical injustice and racism and imperialism into what we now have as the Good Friday Agreement. And it's called Good Friday because that's when the suffering was worst for Christ. And the two communities in Northern Ireland, Protestant and Catholic, were killing each other. So why not have a Good Friday Agreement and believe that the crucifixion and the killing can actually lead to, it can be a Good Friday in the sense of leading through the Sabbath, which is the atheistic moment. You know, you have the theism, tribal, you know, agonistic, militant, murderous theisms of Protestant, Catholic, loyalist, Republican, going through the Sabbath, which is let's just lay down our guns for now, disarmament, and then leading to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, where they came to the discovery and the decision that you could be British or Irish or both, right? Now, that's a contradiction because there are two mutually exclusive sovereignty claims by the United Kingdom on Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic on Northern Ireland. So you can't share sovereignty. Every nation state is one and indivisible, as Rousseau said and Boudin said. So it's impossible to share sovereignty and be British and Irish or both. But the both is where you laugh, where you discover your common humanity anatheistically, and you use your imagination. You can be British or Irish or both, right? And that's making the impossible possible. And it's where you, on Patrick's Day, which was yesterday, the patron saint of Ireland, you raise a glass of whiskey or Guinness and you laugh together. The Protestant and the Catholic laugh together and say, you know, we've made the impossible possible. So that's my final example from my local, personal, native Irish tradition on my native national feast day of St. Patrick.
Thank you very much. As our time draws to a close, we must conclude today's meeting. First and foremost, we wish to express our gratitude and admiration to Professor Richard Kearney for accepting our invitation and for sharing his insights and faith in the world, the divine, and humanity. I believe we can all agree that we end this meeting enriched. It has been a privilege to speak with you, and we sincerely hope that this encounter will mark the beginning of further exchanges in the future. I would also like to express our appreciation to all of you for your presence and for the thoughtful questions addressed to our guests. Your engagement is what gives meaning to gatherings such as this. We encourage you to follow our official channels, the Alexandria Association, where information about the next meetings will be announced. The upcoming events promise to be of considerable interest. We are just getting started. Thank you once again for your participation. We look forward to the pleasure of welcoming you again in the near future, whenever it comes. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I might just say a final word, it has been a huge pleasure and privilege for me to engage in conversation with you. I'm sure there were others who wanted to ask questions, and I'm sorry that some of my responses were very elaborate and perhaps didn't allow a hospitality to many others who wanted to ask questions. But I also wanted to say a big thanks to those translators, those publishers, those editors, those readers of the Anatheist translation, as it were, of the book into Polish, which for me is experienced as a great sense of welcome. I feel welcomed by your group and your readers and your language and your culture. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Once again, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.